This will be a class in regard to preparation for marriage. And first of all, we want to talk about God's purpose in marriage. As everyone knows, God performed the first wedding in Eden, and He intended that their home would be like heaven. And even though sin has come in and human beings are fallen creatures, still we are to strive to make home as much like heaven as possible. In Ephesians, the 5th chapter, it addresses that husbands are to love their wives as Christ loved the church. So actually the home is to be an example of the kind of love that exists between Jesus and all of us. If we keep that in mind, then we will be able to be careful on some of the mistakes that others have made. It's not unknown today that the divorce rate is extremely high. The opinions vary and the research varies. But if we take a conservative figure of around 1/3 of the marriages fail, and it tends to be that when people get married a second time or a third time, that's even more likely to fail. So one of the things that we have to watch out for is that we don't get married because of infatuation. There is always two types of things that go under the label of love. One is true love. This comes from God. And when we have true love for someone, we are not so much interested in whether they do everything they should to make us happy, but as to whether we are doing all we can to make them happy. Infatuation, on the other hand, has self as the center, and so the reason for getting married is to be made happy, and usually during the courtship that does happen. Perhaps you've heard of Gary Chapman, who addresses the 5 love languages, and I believe he has discovered a good idea. And as I've thought about the usual courtship, it seems like during courtship that we speak all 5 languages. And so of course the other person is very fulfilled, and they feel that they've found the one that can make them happy for the rest of their life. However, it doesn't stay that way usually after marriage for very long, and we tend to revert to the love language that we most naturally use and that we would expect other people to use to tell us that they love us. But unfortunately, often we have different love languages, and so even though our partner is trying to tell us they love us, we're not getting the message, and we feel very unloved. And even what can make that worse is if what we actually had was infatuation. Now the problem with infatuation is that it's very powerful, and it pushes us very hard to think that we found the right one, but it doesn't really last. And maybe you've heard the phrase that love flew out the window. Well, that was probably not love, that was infatuation. Although even love can be slowly destroyed, but it doesn't disappear fast. If something goes away fast, then it's infatuation. Now, love, true love, is actually a principle. And Jesus spoke of that in the Golden Rule, that we should do unto others as we would like them to do unto us. So the focus there is on the other person, and it operates as a principle, not primarily an emotion. Now, of course, there are emotions that go along with love, and God's plan is that the emotions will get stronger as time goes by. But if the principle isn't operating, then the emotions often cannot develop well, or they get hurt and it damages the relationship. So it's a principle that we act according to what the other person needs and according to what we promised when we got married, that we will love each other until death do us part. We don't always feel like loving each other, but we can always act in a loving way. And when we boil that all down, what it's really talking about are many of the little habits of life, like kindness, being kind even when someone is not treating us kind, being thoughtful, being showing that we care about what the other person is going through. And so we need to test and make sure that what we have is love. Now, another big pitfall of why people get married is that they often get married primarily based on physical attentions. And today it's not unusual for people to even have a sexual experience before marriage. But it starts with just small things like holding hands and putting our arm around one another and kissing and so on. And so the wisest thing for a person to do is to leave out of their period of what we might call courtship. I like to use the word courtship because it's a serious thing, not just sampling this one and that one and the other one. God doesn't want us to cause someone to start having feelings for us and then we go off and find somebody else. But, it doesn't mean that it has to come to marriage, but it's a serious relationship that we would pursue unless we are convinced that we're not for each other. But the idea of leaving out the physical attentions until at least when we're engaged, and then stopping short of kissing, I read a report of a sociologist study of 13 different cultures, and they discovered that all 13 cultures end up bonding pretty much the same way by the exact same steps. But the thing that I found very interesting is that if the two had been involved in kissing and then they broke up, they would suffer some of the trauma of divorce. Not, of course, the fullness of it, but some of the pain. And it doesn't seem like a Christian would want to run the risk of doing that to someone else unless, of course, they have agreed and they're planning to marry. So the thing we are supposed to do, instead of depending on the physical to get so motivated about each other that we want to get married, it's not hard to want to marry when we're involved in the physical, because God made it to bind two people together and to make it easier for them to really be willing to stay together and be faithful until death do them part. But when we haven't made the decision to marry, then there's a risk that we will break it off. And so I always recommend that you do something else. The most important thing to find out about each other is compatibility. What do I mean by compatibility? It has to do with how many habits do we have that are irritating to the other party, and how many habits do they have that are irritating to us. Now, often couples say, well, they'll change, or even I'll change them, and so they don't worry about the things that are very irritating. To give an example, if a person is always late to appointments, but the other person always likes to be on time, this can get very frustrating over a period of 25 years if the person never conquers that weakness. But that's just an example. There are, literally hundreds of different habits. And so as we spend time together and as we talk over different subjects to understand how each other thinks about it, we are looking for what are their weak points and what are their strong points. Now, it doesn't mean because somebody has a weak point that we're not going to marry them, but it's very important how we're going to relate, because suppose they don't change, then we're going to have to put up with that for a long, long time. So what we should do is consider how frustrating that is and how many of these frustrations there are in different areas. If there's one or two, it's probably likely that practically every marriage has some. But if you have 10 or more, then you may be setting yourself up for so much frustration that you won't be able to stay together. Of course, God is able to help us to put up with anything, but most people don't seem to today. And so to make it easier on ourselves, we need to find a partner that kind of clicks with us. Their weak points don't bother us too much, and their strong points we really appreciate. And that will be a better choice. You won't really have a problem physically liking the other person. But if these other things are not pleasing to us, it makes it very hard to keep on loving them. It's a lot of work. If somebody sees this that's already married, then that's our responsibility to find a way to live with that. But when we're in the courtship, if we find incompatibility, then it's better for us to agree that it's not best to keep on the relationship and look for someone that is more compatible. Another thing that I think hinders the marriages being able to stick is that nobody thinks about divorce before marriage. They just think, well, we'll be happy forever after, and if we're not, we'll just divorce and get somebody else. But if you accept the Bible principle that once we are married, we are not to consider divorce outside of adultery. No other cause is legitimate according to the Bible. And so we have to seriously consider, do I really love this person enough? And are we compatible enough to where we can stick together throughout whatever happens? This means commitment. That we have to be fully committed. If we're thinking, well, if it doesn't work, I'll get a divorce, is pretty sure that we will get a divorce. So we have to think in terms of, can I truly commit to this person for the rest of my life? And regardless of what happens, I will accept it as God's will for my life to learn how to cope with this situation. Now, of course, it's impossible to find out everything about marriage before we get married, or about each other before we get married. So there's always going to be some surprises afterward. But if we've done our work well, it shouldn't be enough to really destroy the marriage. So think about divorce ahead of time, the seriousness of not getting divorced and the only reason for it. And make sure that your commitment is really a solid commitment.